A very good afternoon, Professor C. Mohan, Director, Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS, Professor Sunil Amrith, Mehra Family Professor of South Asian Studies and Professor of History, Harvard University, and Academic Advisor, Asia Research Institute, NUS. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Doshni and I will be your MC for today. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, ISAS-NUS, I welcome you to this afternoon's joint ISAS-ARI public lecture titled The Bay of Bengal, History, Memory, and the Future. To start the proceeding, I would like to invite Professor C. Mohan to deliver the opening remarks. Professor Mohan, please.
Let me join my colleagues in welcoming you all for this afternoon's session with Professor Sunil Amrith. Of course, his formidable scholarly reputation precedes him, so very delighted to welcome Professor Sunil Amrith to our ISAS-ARI. He's actually strong connections to Singapore. He's also affiliated to the Asia Research Institute. So it's a privilege for us to host him here this afternoon. Before I hand over to Professor Amrith, let me say a few words about the Bay of Bengal. Bay of Bengal has been a forgotten region for a long, long time, but it has begun to reclaim our attention in recent years. And I think a large part of the contribution to making the world aware of the Bay of Bengal and its past and its potential future has been Professor Amrith himself. His book, Crossing the Bay of Bengal, has been widely acclaimed. I think in many ways came just at the right time of people to see the importance of the emerging region of Bay of Bengal. One way of illustrating the significance of the Bay of Bengal is to go back to the Second World War. It's just a snapshot of one little bit of what we've forgotten about the Bay of Bengal. It was in the Bay of Bengal, it was also called the BCI Theatre, Burma, China, India Theatre. There's a famous book on it called The Forgotten War. Essentially, this is where the armies of India, the armies of nationalist China, the armies of the United States, and of course the army of Japan, all came together. It was a theatre where you had the British Indian Army working with the Chinese nationalist army, fully backed by the Americans, who were trying to build a bridge across the Himalayas, both air bridge as well as a land bridge. It was called the Stilwell Road air bridge. We're struggling to find those survivors of that campaign, and of course trying to push back the Japanese out of the Burmese occupation, because we had actually, in India, of course, two armies. One was trying to push the Japanese out, and another one which just came in with the Japanese to fight for India's independence. So it's a history of where it seems so remote from today's geopolitics, that the kind of powers that came together and the kind of things that they were doing. And that's only one part. As Britain, shocked by the fall of Singapore, tried to push back against Japanese occupation in Malaya and Burma, some new terms came into existence. One of them is called Southeast Asia. The word didn't exist in international lexicon till the Southeast Asia Command was set up under Lord Mountbatten, headquartered in Sri Lanka, Canada. So it tells you how the region was very, very different from what we think of it today. But of course, after the war, you had Burma, China, and India all turned inward, largely turning their back on the seas. You had Great Britain, which went back home. A couple of European powers wanted to come back, the French, the Dutch. But the power of nationalism in Asia was too strong to let that stand. But the general mood was one of inward orientation in this part of the world, and that steadily reduced from the second half of the 20th century, the Bay of Bengal into a strategic backwater. But for the Americans, the focus was on Northeast Asia, on East Asia, on Atlantic, and the Russians were still some way before they came into the Indian Ocean. So you had actually a relative calm and tranquility of very little happening in the Bay of Bengal. But that, I believe, is changing today, because there are two, three things that have happened. I think one is the globalization of China and India. Their influence, their impact on regions far beyond their borders is beginning to reflect. far more significantly in the case of China, a lot less in the case of India. But the rise of China and India is going to fold this region into forms and structures that we've not been familiar with us in the second half of the 20th century. But if you go back to the past, you might be able to see some value of it. So when Britain was exploring the routes into Western China, Yunnan was called the back door to China. In fact, British India tried to layer a railway line from the Arakan coast, we know these days, to Yunnan, through the mountains, of course. And of course, British ran out of money, they couldn't really finish it. Today, if you see the Chinese route, or the Great Pipeline today from Yunnan to the Bay of Bengal, it's exactly the same. That the structural processes, I think, as rise of China, the economic growth, its impact on the neighboring regions and that of India is beginning to emerge itself, I think, in very, very interesting forms. The Bay of Bengal is also, of course, a bridge between South and Southeast Asia. We've talked a lot about the land connectivity between Northeast India and Southeast Asia, but the Bay of Bengal, open sea, no major territorial disputes, and is actually a very fertile way of actually connecting the two regions. And of course, at one end of the corner of this Bay of Bengal is what we have. Singapore is there, and I think historically Singapore's role in bridging the Indo-Pacific. Today we see the Bay of Bengal, along with the South China Sea, forms the very core of what the new region that's being constructed called the Indo-Pacific. You also have the Bay of Bengal where China's Belt and Road initiatives come together. You looked at the Chinese maps, I mean, they keep showing Calcutta, I don't know, Calcutta is still not part of it, but the fact is, that is where you see Chinese maritime Silk Road coming into their ambition. Chinese pipeline is already there at Chakku Island. Chinese want to do a lot more things there. You have actually a whole lot of things that the Chinese want to do. And the overland routes connecting Yunnan to the Bay of Bengal is already happening. The Silk Road, that is the maritime side, will also begin to happen. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands, once considered a penal colony, not of great value when the British dominated the Indian Ocean, but today in a new dynamic could actually come back as an island for force projection into the Malacca Sea, if you want, or the other way, if somebody else has it. So therefore, we see a number of new developments in the region, but most of it is really from a limited, prosaic, geopolitical perspective. But Professor Amrith is going to bring a far more sweeping, a far more comprehensive picture of the changing Bay of Bengal, about people, about the migration, about the impact on the environment. We have a whole lot of things that have gone into the narrative that Professor Sunil Amrith's book, the Crossing the Bay of Bengal, presents us, and that's also been a topic for discussion today, for this lecture today. For us at ISAS, the Bay of Bengal is emerging as a major area of research, and that's added reason why we're so happy to welcome Professor Amrith here this afternoon. We're also happy to co-host this event with the Asia Research Institute, and I think we hope that this is the beginning of a process where South Asia ISAS will begin to collaborate with other institutions in NUS to see the growing intersection between South Asia and other regions in this project. So let me stop here. Let me welcome Professor Sunil Amrith. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Mohan. It is now my pleasure to invite Professor Sunil Amrith to deliver the ISAS-ARI public lecture on the Bay of Bengal, History, Memory, and the Future. Professor Amrith, please.
Professor Raja Mohan, distinguished guests, it's really an honor and a pleasure to be here today. I would like to thank ISAS for this kind invitation, and thanks to ARI for co-sponsoring it, and also for hosting me as a visitor this summer. Just in the few weeks that I've been in Singapore, I've had a sense of witnessing Asian studies being remade, both by virtue of our location at the heart of Southeast Asia and by virtue of the times we are living in, when old certainties and old geographies are crumbling around us. It is in that spirit that I offer these thoughts today, on the Bay of Bengal as a historical and contemporary region, drawing on different aspects of work I've been doing for more than a decade. I suspect many of you here aren't historians, so I also offer this in the spirit of dialogue across fields, inspired by both confidence and doubt that my discipline has something to offer our analysis of the Bay of Bengal today and looking to the future. Recent discussions of the Bay of Bengal in the media by strategic commentators seems to me to have been characterized by a central paradox. On the one hand, by wild hope that this is the great untapped frontier, and on the other hand, by an enduring sense of disappointment. Let me take as an example one of the most thoughtful recent analyses by Carnegie India, founded by Professor Mohan, of course. After decades of neglect, the Carnegie report states, the Bay of Bengal is today reassuming strategic and economic salience. A quarter of the traded goods in the world pass through it. The countries that border it have a combined GDP of 2.7 trillion US dollars. It is rich in oil and natural gas. And here, for example, is a map of the Bay of Bengal divided into prospecting blocks. Yet, the authors of the Carnegie report lament that despite its potential, the Bay of Bengal, quote, distinguishes itself globally by abysmal levels of integration, reflecting the deep divide between South and Southeast Asia. They point out that intra-regional trade within the Bay of Bengal amounts to only 5% of total trade, as compared with 29% within ASEAN. Worse, they observe that in terms of trade volumes, in terms of infrastructural connections, we may today be behind where we were at the beginning of the 1950s. So what happened? That is a question I tried to address in a book I wrote a few years ago called Crossing the Bay of Bengal. I'd like to revisit that question today from a few different angles. Constantino Xavier, one of the authors of the Carnegie Report, argues that what he calls a new Bay of Bengal narrative will not emerge unless, I quote, scholars are incentivized to dig into the past and recover the rich sense of community that animated the region until the 20th century. He very generously cites my work as a source for that, but it leads me now to ask a set of questions about whose histories, what sorts of history we have in mind, whether they can and should be recovered. But I'd like to begin with names, because names that we give to bodies of water as much as to pieces of land can shape our perceptions in enduring ways. Names may even mislead us. What we know as the Bay of Bengal, of course, did not always have that name. The sea has, for many centuries and in many languages, been known by many different names. The Chola Sea, or the Chola Lake, going back a millennium. In many other literary and imaginative traditions, the sea had no name. It was merely the dark, liquid expanse, both threatening and alluring. Before it became the Bay of Bengal, it was often just the fierce, unbounded sea. Folk traditions that were still very much alive in the 20th century present the Bay of Bengal similarly as a place of terror and adventure. Student ethnographers in rural Bengal traveled up and down the country in the 1920s and 30s collecting local legends and ballads. And in these Bengali songs, the sea was simply the terrible bay, the Kalapan. The ballads imagined the ferocious waves, but also the promise of fortune that lay at the other side of the sea. It was in fact the Portuguese who named it the Bay of Bengal, Golfo de Bengal. At a 1938 International Congress of Geography in Amsterdam, Portuguese scholars Armando Cortesão and Avelino Teixeira presented a paper on what they called the first account of the Far East in the 16th century, in which they described and discussed the manuscript of Francisco Rodriguez's O Libro, found in the library of the Chamber of Deputies in Paris. Rodriguez produced one of the first known maps of the Bay of Bengal. And here is another one by the Italian cartographer Russelli. It's from 1574, and you can see it's one of the earliest maps to label this Golfo de Bengala. Why Bay of Bengal? All of that had to do with imperial interests. This nomenclature spoke of Bengal's fabled wealth, its role as in the regional and global economy of the time, most notably as a source of textiles. One of the ironies of the Bay of Bengal's transformation in the 19th century, which is what I will mostly talk about today, was that it emerged as a maritime world much less centered on Bengal. By 1900, I would say Singapore, much more than Calcutta, was the heart of the Bay of Bengal, even though by any strict geographical definition, Singapore lies outside it. It was a multi-centered world, a multilingual world, a multi-ethnic, multi-religious world. It is this plurality forged by centuries of cultural and economic exchange between the people of the ocean's rim that make it distinctive in global history. And this is perhaps what we find alluring about it, as a counterpoint to a history of imperial domination and nationalist separation. I have often asked myself why, over the last 20 years, we have become nostalgic for the history of the Indian Ocean. What is it exactly that we wish to evoke in our narratives of spice traders and merchants and port cities? For there's no question that over the past generation or so, the Indian Ocean has been visible, culturally visible, in the way that it really wasn't in the second half of the 20th century. Since around the turn of the millennium, it has inspired many museum exhibitions, including here in Singapore. It has come alive in the fiction of Amrith, which has found a very wide reach in and beyond the region. It is evident in the scholarly flourishing of Indian Ocean studies, including here in the US. The scholarly appeal is clear. I think the history of connections across the Indian Ocean has helped us to see beyond what had become very rigid boundaries in area studies, which Professor Mohan alluded to in his introductory remarks. Boundaries dividing the study of South Asia from Southeast Asia from East Asia, Asia from Africa, for that matter. Some historians have even gone so far as to speak of the Indian Ocean as method. What they mean by that, I think, is suggesting that actually recovering and tracing the lives, the worldviews, the cultures of the non-elite people who crossed the Indian Ocean might provide a very different perspective in the making of the modern world. The political appeal of the Indian Ocean arena at the same time, I think, needs much less discussion before this audience. Professor Rajamohan has already outlined some of the key changes, the reasons why the Bay of Bengal in particular is back at the forefront of discussion. It has emerged as a vital strategic and economic area, especially in the context of China's rise as a global power, increasingly ambitious plans for the revival of a maritime Silk Road, and given the importance of Southeast Asia to both the previous and the current Indian government's strategic ambitions. It was under colonial domination that the Indian Ocean, and above all the Bay of Bengal, reached a new level of connectedness. And this colonial history of this region is, I think, vital to understanding both the potential and the constraints of our moment. The scars of that century are deep. Perhaps that is why we have tended to look to the Indian Ocean's far more distant past for a more edifying historical narrative. But one of the ironies I'd like to point out is this: the past we long for is not the period of the Bay of Bengal's most intensive connection. That high point of connectivity came unequivocally under British imperialism. It was accompanied by violence, by inequality, by divisions that blew up in the middle of the 20th century, and we are still picking up the pieces today. It is that history that I'd like to spend most of the lecture talking about. The irony that the Bay of Bengal both reached a new level of connectedness under the British, but that connectedness contained perhaps the seeds of its own collapse. Europe's Industrial Revolution transformed this sea as much as any other. The demands of British factories precipitated a rush for the commodities of the Indian Ocean's frontiers, for sugar and tea, and then rubber and tin. Massive migration followed. In the 1830s, as political pressure mounted at home for the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, sugar planters looked instead to India for unfree labour. In all, around 1.5 million indentured workers moved from India to destinations across the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. Mauritius, Natal, Trinidad, Fiji were amongst their main destinations. And this was one of the great movements of labour in the 19th century. Alongside indentured labourers, tens of thousands of convicted prisoners from India were transported to the Andaman Islands, we've already heard about, to Bencoolen, to the Straits settlements. They built roads, cleared forests, erected buildings, and cultivated gardens. It was the British Empire's violent appetite for labour, I think, that distinguished the 19th century from the smaller scale but constant circulation of merchants and traders and seafarers in earlier centuries. Here, the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 was really a turning point. It inaugurated the age of the steamship, and most of the migration that followed took place within the Bay of Bengal. On one estimate, more than 90% of all of the emigration from British colonial India took place to just 3 destinations: Burma, which was of course ruled as part of India until 1937, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and the Malay Peninsula. 90% of Indian immigration in the age of empire was to just 3 destinations across the Bay of Bengal. As a very rough estimate, there were something like 28 million passenger journeys across the Bay of Bengal between 1850 and 1940. 28 million passenger journeys. That's not the same as to say there were 28 million people who moved, because many of these journeys would be the same people moving back and forth. And this was a circular pattern of migration. If you add this to the approximately 20 million Chinese who crossed the South China Sea in exactly the same period, we really do have one of the largest movements of people in global history, with consequences that have shaped the world we live in. And I think the Carnegie report that I started with, it was not wrong to suggest that the level of economic, political, cultural integration across the Bay of Bengal was higher a century ago than it is today. Just take a look at this, which is a map of passenger shipping routes across the Bay in 1900. Each of the red lines is a steamship passenger route. And even the AirAsia network map does not look as densely connected as this. This connected every small port down the Indian coast to look at the number of Burmese ports, for example, that are on that map. Places which in the second half of the 20th century dropped off this map, and perhaps are now being revived again. But I think as a snapshot of how intensively connected this world was, this map perhaps speaks louder than many paragraphs. But I think we need to look beyond trade alone to understand more fully the cultural transformations that ensued. That is to say, I have in my mind the question, what, along with people, moved through these red lines? Ideas travelled as fast as people. Port cities around the Bay of Bengal became centres of Tamil and Telugu and Bangla and Burmese and Malay and Chinese print culture. Printing presses were polyglot, as were their staff. Articles were syndicated and copied, moving from shore to shore and from language to language. As Ronit Ricci has shown, in fact, the very first Malay language newspaper that we know of was not printed in Malay, it was printed in Sri Lanka by the long-settled Malay community there. Similarly, one of the earliest Tamil newspapers anywhere was published not in Tamil Nadu, but here in the Straits settlements. There, just a sort of collage of the kinds of print culture I focused on Tamil culture, which is what I've primarily worked on myself, that were being churned out by the printing presses of the cities of the Bay of Bengal. On the left, you have Chairperson, which was one of the first newspapers in the Straits Settlements in Jawi. But what's striking is the very same publishing house also started the first Tamil language newspaper. Commercial advertising you see all around. And the central image is in fact the archive of the Roja Muttai Research Library in Chennai, which is probably the biggest private collection of Tamil manuscripts, printed material anywhere in the world, along with the British Library perhaps. What strikes me is so much of the material that's coming out in the 1870s, 1890s, right to the 20s and 30s in the Roja Muttai's collection is not being published in India, it's being published in Southeast Asia. It's being published by Tamil printers in Rangoon, Colombo, Singapore, in Penang, Kuala Lumpur. And to foreshadow what I'm about to say, what's striking is that after 1914, almost nothing in that collection is published outside India. So there's also a textual way, I think, in which one can chart the rise and later decline of the Bay of Bengal as a region. Thinking about the Tamil press of Singapore and the Straits Settlements, I'm struck even by the specific language in which Tamil newspapers used to describe the world they wrote about. They wrote of Indians overseas. They wrote of South Indian workers. Sometimes they wrote about Indians in Malaya. Sometimes about Indians in the British Empire. Sometimes about the Tamil world. Each of these terms appear frequently, sometimes interchangeably, but each evoked a slightly different geography. So alongside a growing sense that there was an Indian diaspora, there was a much more finely grained sense of a Tamil diaspora that was focused on this part of the world, a Telugu-speaking diaspora that was primarily located in Burma. The awareness of being part of an imperial diaspora was balanced against a much more specific sense of a Tamil or Telugu-speaking world that connected South and Southeast Asia. Yet these diasporic newspapers did not only look to their homelands. The Tamil newspapers of Singapore and Penang and KL in the 20s and 30s very often engaged in debate with the local Malay press over rights and citizenship. They syndicated columns from local Chinese newspapers about social reform. They tangled with colonial officials about sanitation and public space and the future of migration policy. So these newspapers, this public sphere, was both deeply rooted in the colonial Southeast Asian context and yet linked to a broader Indian Ocean world. The Bay of Bengal was linked by the movement of religious ideas, a revival and resurgence perhaps of earlier links. Consider the journeys of Anagarika Dharmapala, a Sri Lankan Buddhist thinker who sought to revive earlier roots of pilgrimage and cultural exchange, linking Sri Lanka, Burma, India, and Thailand. Dharmapala crossed the Bay of Bengal many times. He saw the bay as the heartland of the Theravada Buddhist of the world, while also making broader connections across the empire and indeed in North America. The Journal of his Mahabodhi Society had subscribers across the Bay of Bengal and around the world, and I've often found that looking at the subscription lists for some of these newspapers is one of the most revealing snapshots we have of how widely they traveled. If we turn from well-known figures like Dharmapala to the more humble worlds of migrant laborers, there too we see the emergence of hybrid cultures of performance, cuisine, religious procession, all of which are still imprinted on the landscape of a city like Singapore today. But however densely woven the threads of culture and commerce were across the Indian Ocean, these frayed and collapsed in the 1930s and 40s. Migration around the Bay of Bengal reached a peak in 1926-27. With the global economic depression, connectivity began to erode. And I think one of the lessons of history for our contemporary moment is that linkages can be fragile. They can break as quickly as they grow. The global economic depression of the 1930s made the inequalities of colonialism starkly visible. Economic crisis then, as now, raised new questions about inequality, about redistribution, which made the question of political inclusion and exclusion more important than it had been in the frontier years of the 1870s or 1880s. In the Straits Settlements Legislative Council, for example, the question arose, who gets to represent the Tamil-speaking people of this colony. And Jaffna Tamils and Tamils from South India competed with each other for the right to represent the Tamil community. There are many, many similar stories about different communities. So representation comes to mean something that it had not previously meant. The collapse of global commodity markets in the 30s led to a reversal of the flows of migration that had really become entrenched over the previous 60 years. For the first time since the 1870s, the number of people leaving Straits settlements in Malaya to go back to India or China was greater than the number of new arrivals, and this was between 1930 and 33. Emergent nationalist groups in Burma, Malaya, and Ceylon pressed for immigration controls to protect local labour. British Malaya, for example, introduced immigration controls for the first time in 1930, initially directed at reducing Chinese migration, but also by suspending recruitment licenses, it sought to control Indian labour too. The first episode of intercommunal violence in Depression-era Southeast Asia took place on Rangoon's docks in 1930, when a group of striking Indian labourers returned to find their jobs had been taken by the Burmese workers, and the localised conflict spilled over into ethnic riots that killed hundreds of people and really poisoned inter-ethnic relations for decades to come. Throughout this period, resentment of Indian immigration across the Bay of Bengal was in a sense mirrored by an increasing Indian hostility to emigration, to out-migration. By the 1930s, Indian nationalist writers and politicians denounced the movement of labour to Southeast Asia. The Congress's Searchlight newspaper in the early 1930s, for example, condemned the resumption of Indian emigration to Malaya after the Depression. The sense was that Indian labour was needed at home to build the nation in the making, which by the 1930s most Indian nationalists believed was on the horizon. And indeed, in 1938, under pressure from Indian nationalist activists, the British government of India banned all further labour emigration from India to Malaya, from India to Ceylon the following year. So what you see in the 1930s is not just hostility to Indian immigration on the part of nationalist groups across the Bay of Bengal, but an increasing sense that the Indian leadership has, and this really makes its way into how the Indian state behaves in the first 20 years after independence, that labour migration overseas was something that should be stopped. So even before the Second World War brought traffic across the Indian Ocean to a standstill, forced hundreds of thousands of people to seek refuge, the era of mass labour migration was already at an end. The maritime frontier had closed. The key to understanding the rapidity of this fragmentation, I think, lies in recognizing that however closely the Bay of Bengal's coasts were linked by commerce, by kinship, by cultural circulation, there was never a corresponding political structure to encompass the entire region. Not even the British imperial frame could hold the Bay of Bengal together. In fact, quite the opposite. The Bay of Bengal was deliberately governed by the British as a patchwork of separate territories, often deliberately kept apart. It seemed to lack coherence as a unit for the kind of planned economic development that held such promise for so many in Asia in the middle of the 20th century. As the war ended and Asia's new leaders attained or seized power from the discredited colonial rulers, there was consensus that citizens' rights and workers' rights would best be protected within relatively closed national borders, with much stricter controls over entry and exit. In India and in Burma, to some extent in Sri Lanka, this was accompanied by an economic turn inwards towards state socialism and import substitution. Circuits of migration that had taken people overseas were reoriented internally to build the roads and steel plants and dams that promised a brighter future to Asia's newly empowered citizens. And the literal truth of this struck me when working on quite a different project, a project on the control of water in modern South Asia. I was reading through archival files on the construction of the Tungabhadra Dam, one of the showpiece infrastructure projects of the new Indian government in the 1950s, what Prime Minister Nehru called temples of the new age. And there was a small note in the archival file that pointed out that the very first group of labourers to arrive at the construction site for the Tungabhadra Dam were Telugu porters who were refugees from Burma during the war. So those old circuits of migration that had taken people across the Bay of Bengal were increasingly in the 1950s oriented inwards. Almost everywhere around the Indian Ocean's rim, the post-war moment saw enshrined the assumption that where one was born, where one lived, where one belonged, that these three things all should overlap. Needless to say, this left large numbers of people in an uncomfortable position. Migrants and the descendants of migrants had to find a place for themselves as minorities within newly created nations. Geopolitical fears also played a role. At the Asian Relations Conference that was held in Delhi in March 1947, which was really the first meeting of Asian leaders, the Burmese delegate expressed his fear that, quote, Burma was between two powers. It was terrible to be ruled by a Western power, he said, but it would be even more so to be ruled by an Asian power. Newly independent countries turned instead to either or both of the blocs of the Cold War and forged bilateral deals of trade and aid. As a historian, I'm struck by the material implications of this change. Everywhere in Asia, independence, one of the institutions of independence was the building of national archives. Indian National Archives, the Sri Lankan National Archives, the Burmese National Archives. And in that process itself, the documentary history of the Bay of Bengal comes to be filed in different places, shelved and categorized in different ways. In the Imperial Archive, there's always an index entry for Indian Ocean, for Bay of Bengal. Those index entries disappear in the 1940s, mirroring the collapse of this region. In seeking to build a better future, Asia's new leaders sought to move away from a world of free trade and large-scale migration, preferring to focus their efforts on providing for their citizens within national borders. And if there's one urgent question before us today, it is, how do we foster connectivity on a basis of equality? Because the problem with the nature of connectivity across the Bay of Bengal in the late 19th and early 20th century is that it was built on a basis of profound inequality. And it was the recognition of that inequality that led so many political leaders to turn against it. How do we forge links of commerce and culture without perpetuating inequality or hierarchy? It's an open question. As a way of evoking the human experience of this decline in connectivity across the Bay, I can think of little more evocative than the photographs of Dr. Uy Cheng Ki, a Penang photographer, in fact a physician by trade, but an incredibly accomplished photographer. In the late 1970s, Dr. Uy took a series of portraits of what was known as the area around Penang's docks, the area now known as Little India, wasn't called that at the time. By the end of the 1970s, Penang had lost its free port status. It was in economic decline. Connections across the Bay of Bengal had dwindled to probably their lowest point in centuries. And Dr. Uy's photographs deliberately sought to document the end of a world of commerce and circulation. The enclave gave off a feeling of having been abandoned, Dr. Uy said. It was as if the party was over and only leftovers remained. It had become a dilapidated and sad place. This is one of his photos of the last generation of betel nut workers, all of whom were migrants from Tamil Nadu. And this whole series of portraits, we can read in them suffering and resilience, courage and defeat. But what is striking is the changed context. When Dr. Uy took those photographs in the late 1970s, he told me nobody was interested in them. They were exhibited once and never seen again. He remarks on the irony of the fact that only 10 years ago were they rediscovered, re-exhibited, republished at a time when a resurgent Penang, now with World Heritage status, looked to the Indian Ocean for both a sense of its past and perhaps for its future. So time reshapes memory. When these photographs were taken. These men were, in a sense, the defeated, the people that history seemed to have left behind. And yet now, perhaps we think of them and their migratory lives quite differently. At the turn of the 21st century, the Bay of Bengal was once again at the heart of international politics, a region that seemed of little relevance in the heyday of post-colonial nation building and the Cold War seems vital again. First, the Bay of Bengal is now, as it was in the 18th century, 19th century, during the Second World War, as Professor Mohan pointed out, an arena for strategic competition between rising powers in their competition for energy resources, shipping lanes, and cultural influence. It's a region that has seen sustained and rapid economic growth, though not, as I pointed out earlier, necessarily an equivalent rise in connectivity. At the same time, the Bay of Bengal's littoral stands at the front line of Asia's experience of climate change. Its densely populated coastal zone is home to nearly 500 million people. What role in this current moment might an understanding of the Bay of Bengal's history play? A version of history has come to play a very prominent role in both Chinese and Indian cultural diplomacy in the wider Indian Ocean region. China's One Belt, One Road initiative is accompanied by a coordinated push to gain UNESCO recognition for sites across the Silk Road. India, for its part, has been promoting Project Mohan, a proposal to commemorate the Indian Ocean's contribution to the world's cultural heritage as a peaceful zone of cosmopolitan commerce. The India Foundation held a conference on the Indian Ocean here in Singapore back in 2016, and India's then Foreign Secretary, S. Jaishankar, used his opening address to suggest reviving the Indian Ocean as a geopolitical concept, taking full advantage of what he called the ties of kinship and boundary that span the waters. Many speakers at that conference evoked a shared history of Hindu and Buddhist cultural links across South and Southeast Asia. These visions appealed simultaneously to the Indian Ocean's ancient past and to its future. But we often, perhaps deliberately, forget the region's history in the 19th and 20th centuries. It's quite natural to seek to emphasize the more edifying aspects of the past in trying to construct a better future. The problem, as I suggested earlier in the lecture, is that the scars of the Indian Ocean's modern history run deep, both from a deliberate British policy of divide and rule, and as an unintended consequence of economic structures. The era of mass migration introduced new hierarchies into the Bay of Bengal, and we still live with their effects. The roots of many contemporary challenges lie in the intensive connection of the Indian Ocean by British power, and in the subsequent unravelling of those links in the middle of the 20th century. The consequences of that regional disintegration continue to shape how different communities, different social groups experience the new sense of potential across the Bay of Bengal. I would suggest that what we need is a sense of multiple, overlapping histories of the Bay of Bengal as a regional arena. Yes, we need the civilizational, unifying histories of the Indian Ocean from ancient times. But there's another kind of history of the Bay of Bengal that replicates, and I borrow here the language of the British novelist Hilary Mantel, not the historian's chronology, but the way memory works in leaps, loops, flashes. I think that your colleague, Professor Eng Seng-Ho, is right to argue that diasporas carry the continuities of Indian Ocean history. Many of these diasporas have deep cultural memories. Many of them have outlasted empires, but not all of them have. In charting different endings, I think we come back to some of the very big questions. How far does the Bay of Bengal have a life as a regional arena, independent of its member nation states? Is there such a thing as a Bay of Bengal culture that does transcend borders? We do need to look to history for that, but the answers that history gives us are complex. How do old and new diasporic roots and communities intersect? And why does this still matter to us today? Wander around the streets of any port city around the Bay of Bengal, and you will not find a museum to the Bay's history. Look at any school history curriculum in the region, and it is likely that students will learn about their own country's histories, maybe their immediate neighbours, probably European or American history, but not the histories of their neighbours around the Bay of Bengal, still less the history of interaction and connection and migration and trade. One of my hopes as a historian is that we might find ways of bringing the Bay of Bengal's rich past to a much wider audience. In doing so, perhaps we can enrich a sense of regional identity, which is capacious and plural, that is able to encompass the diversity of nations, languages, cultures, and religions that have always coexisted in this part of the world, while also acknowledging the conflicts that have arisen and which are not always healed. A frank reckoning with the recent past of the Bay of Bengal, as much as its deeper history, can be instructive in our times. I think there are lessons to be learned from the successes and failures of earlier attempts to build institutions across the Indian Ocean, in the recovery of paths not taken, in the imagination of alternative futures that emerged so richly from Asia's earlier era of mass migration. And in them, perhaps we will find seeds for a vision of how the oceans may serve as a connective thread between peoples and cultures. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Amrith. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now have the question and answer session. I would like to have Professor Mohan on stage to chair the question and answer session.
Thank you for that wonderful, stimulating, and very moving in some ways presentation. I think the history that we've tended to forget and the potential for reconstituting some of it at least. So the floor is going to be open shortly, so please ask questions, comments, whatever it is, but make them brief. But before we open the floor, I just had one proposition with two politically incorrect statements with it. From what you said, I think it's also that imperialism united but nationalism divided. It's part of which contradicts the general narrative that Indian Ocean was a great thing before the imperialists came, while later the imperialists divided in multiple axes, therefore we got stuck, which is the common narrative. But actually, it is really about capitalism, that modern capitalism transcended the old coastal ways of community, because monsoon still got the Arabs to the Cochin coast, or that kind of movement existed. But it is really the modernizing economic forces that forced an expansive integration of the region. And then because British had problems with it, the rise of nationalism there and socialism that actually came to disintact. But today, as we look at it, I think when Asia goes capitalist, and China's globalizing its economy, and India's doing its much slower fashion, so could this be the force that would compel a reconnection of the social, of the Bay?
I think one of the things that strikes me is the nature of integration in this region, especially at its high point in the late 19th century, was primarily economic. And though the whole region was ruled by the British Empire, in fact, the British made no effort to create any sort of regional structures. Quite the opposite. In fact, they were quite keen. In fact, one of the things that strikes me looking at the archives is that, in fact, even under British imperialism, the governments of India and Malaya behaved towards each other almost like separate states. They were constantly fighting about labor conditions, about migration, about control, So I think one of the things that strikes me is that if you look at the Bay of Bengal today, one sees, again, a resurgence in migration, commercial connections, but apart from BIMSTEC, which I think is much more of a presence than perhaps it was when it started, the structure of institutions still make the Bay of Bengal somewhat odd as a region. It doesn't fit, it's not ASEAN, SAARC. In many ways, it is between those kinds of institutions. Whether a more assertive presence of China or India can themselves sort of bring about that sort of institutional umbrella, which I think this region has never quite had, is an open question. But I think the point is the slightly provocative statement is right, that the irony is that when we talk about the Indian Ocean history, we mean the pre-colonial history. We mean the history of a region that was not dominated by any one power, that was largely peaceful. Yet, if what we're interested in is connections, in fact the high point of connection comes after that world had faded. And that connection, of course, contained many, many problems. And there were good reasons why I think the generation of the mid-20th century turned away from it. It partly was trying to undo the damage, but perhaps ignoring the good that set of connections have done.
Singapore was an exception, in a sense, thinking globally and retaining those connections, while most of the big nations actually shut down.
Right.
And Singapore, still the notion of a free city, still helped. But today, of course, the Chinese, Japanese, Indian capital, could, assuming that they can cooperate, right, still produce that structure.
Right.
So the floor is open, so please make short, sharp, incisive comments and questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Professor Sunil, for your excellent talk, and congratulations for your book. I was wondering that we talked about the sharing and exchange of ideas across the Bay of Bengal. So actually I wanted to know more about was there any common ideas that came out from their exchange of many ideas? It may be about religion or about rights or any political ideas. Or was there any influence of one community to the other community's ideas? Thank you.
That's a wonderful question. I mean, I think one of the limitations in the ways in which historians at least have thought about diasporas is that they focus very much on the relations of diasporas with their homelands. And in fact, one of the things that's most interesting is actually that cross-fertilization of ideas between communities. So I find, for example, my primary research has been mostly on Tamil language material coming out of Southeast Asia. And I am struck by the constant influence of other local ideas. Not just ideas from India and not just European or Western ideas, but in fact, just to give you one example, there's a lot of debate in the 1920s and 30s about social reform. What is it to be modern? How does one live amongst others, amongst strangers, in these very, very diverse port cities? And in many ways, the inspiration for those kinds of debates was very much rooted in the attempt of middle-class professionals, journalists, and others in a port city like this, or indeed like any of the other port cities around the Bay of Bengal, to communicate with one another and to make sense of this unprecedentedly plural world that leads to all sorts of new ideas about citizenship, about rights. I don't think there was consensus. I mean, far from it. I think it was a fractious public sphere. It was a public sphere where, some of the debates that we are still having in the world today about citizenship first emerged. What gives you citizenship? Is it your birth in a place? Is it the contributions you've made to a place? Is it your loyalty? Is it your ancestry? Those debates were very much at the forefront of the kinds of discussions that were happening in a lot of these port cities. I think there were ideas of citizenship that emerged from those conversations which don't bear a lot of resemblance to how we think about citizenship now, which is mostly in exclusive terms, that you are either a citizen or not, you are a citizen of one country and one country only. It's not clear that those alternative ideas were particularly practically thought out, but there were plenty of ideas of multiple layers of belonging, and the kinds of things which, again, we talk about a lot today. I think one finds plenty of traces and indications of that from this diasporic public sphere. But the point about the sphere is that it is deeply diverse. And the one thing that really does strike me is, if you think about cultural diversity just in a purely empirical sense, what is the proportion, how many different nationalities or points of origin are represented? Despite being a colony of the British Empire, Singapore in 1900 was a far more diverse place than London or Paris. Probably not New York, but if you think about any of the European imperial metropolitan cities, they were probably less diverse than a place like Singapore or many of the other port cities around here. So in many ways, I think there's a different conversation that's going on here.
At the back, there was one. Please, we just.
Oh, ISAS-ARI. This was a very, very interesting presentation, and we learned a lot about the economic dimension of migration and so on. But what you talked about was primarily happening above the sea level, and I wonder a bit what actually happened below the sea level. When we talk about the idea of developing oceanic resources, you started, for example, with showing us the offshore oil fields, which arguably can be a substantial source of income, but there were also other sources, obviously, of income, fishing, fish farming, and so on. And when I compare what is going on in this region to a region on which I have done a bit of work, which is the Persian Gulf, then one sees that in the Persian Gulf, in the actual aquatic body, the exploration for offshore oil started already during the 1940s, 1950s. So in parts of this region, this is still during British colonialism. So I wonder, when we talk about the Bay of Bengal, if attempts to systematically develop oceanic resources already started during that colonialism, or is this something that happened during the Nehru-Gandhi administrations, or maybe even later? Thank you.
That's a wonderful question. There's plenty of discussion of fisheries that go right back to the late 19th century. I mean, in fact, there's a very striking discussion, conflict between the British colonial governments of Madras and of Ceylon in the 1920s and 30s about trawlers and about territory. Essentially a conflict about Madras fishing vessels straying into what seems very odd, given that they were both British imperial territories, but they were already starting to think in terms of territorial waters, though not formally in that sense. In terms of deep sea resources, I think you're right to say it happens much later here than it does in the Persian Gulf. That's not a story I know. You know much more about that than I do, but I mean, if you think about it, the Nehru government is interested from the 1950s on in exploiting what resources are available, including fisheries. I mean, there's a much more industrialized approach to fisheries from the 1950s, but in a sense, they are seen as a form of national territory. So in some sense, I think you do see an increasing territorialization of the sea, even before the UN conventions, even before all of that, and that is starting to happen here. But in fact, these conflicts don't really erupt. I was looking at the submissions and judgment of the recent case at the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea between Myanmar and Bangladesh. And in fact, what's striking about that is that both the submissions and the judgment basically present a narrative that this maritime border has long been contested, but it was largely irrelevant until we became interested in resources, and that happens relatively recently. And so, I think there's a lot to be said about that. There's another kind of answer which I've become very interested in, which is the work of the International Indian Ocean Expedition of the early 1960s, which was meteorological, oceanographic, but also very interested in the resources that the sea might hold. And perhaps that's the first attempt to map the Indian Ocean in the kinds of terms that you're talking about. And I think that was a bit of a turning point.
But before you start, I think the Sri Lanka stuff is still going on between Jaffna and Chennai. Is struggling to resolve that issue between Delhi and
Yeah, I have a quick question about, to what extent did the Bay of Bengal figure in the imaginings of groups like the Greater India society, for example. So they are founded, of course, in the 20s, inactive in 30s, 40s, but then they sort of become unfashionable in rural India. So does the Bay of Bengal figure in the imaginings of not only India outreach, but in Asia in general?
I think in many ways the Greater India Society and allied groups do fold the Bay of Bengal into a wider imagination of the Indian Ocean. And even though, in fact, many of them were primarily interested in the Bay of Bengal, tracing what they saw as sort of the movements of Indian civilization, and they were particularly interested in Indonesia and Cambodia, in circulation east more than west, because it was primarily the Hindu-Buddhist connections that they were interested in. I'm struck by the fact that they never emerge as a particularly unified imaginary of the Bay of Bengal. And perhaps that may be one of the explanations for why, despite a particular density of commercial and migratory connections, the region doesn't actually grip the imagination in the same way. There would be very few groups that I'm talking about in the 20s and 30s that would even recognize themselves as specifically being part of a Bay of Bengal world. I mean, I think there are other vocabularies or ways of imagining the links between South and Southeast Asia, to use our contemporary terms, which may well have invoked the Indian Ocean in a slightly broader and slightly vaguer way, but which also used a vocabulary of Greater India, or indeed in the colonial imagination, thinking of Southeast Asia as the Indies, or the Eastern Archipelago, as the archipelagic extension of South Asia. So I think there are different imaginaries that are perhaps contending, but I've never really identified or pinpointed a very distinctive one that focuses on Bengal.
Yes, Deepak.
Thank you. Could you talk about how the prevailing social hierarchies in India at the time were transmitted across the bay into places like Bali or the Champa Kingdom or in Cambodia, and how these engage with the local groups, the local social orders? Thank you.
I think that's one of the perennial questions about the circulation of both culture and society from South Asia to Southeast Asia. I'm very much a modern historian, so I am not in any sense expert in commenting on especially the Balinese or Cambodian Champa culture, but it does seem to me that the consensus is that transformation does inevitably take place with the movement of culture, but certain hierarchies are pretty sticky. I mean, certain hierarchies, I think, do last a very long time. I think there was a lot of discussion in the 19th century about what will migration do to caste. Does migration, in fact, dissolve caste, as some thought, or does it, in fact, make it even more rigid? And my sense from the historical record is that one can see evidence of both of those things. I mean, I think it depends where you're looking and at what period you're looking. You can see that the transmission or circulation of culture from India has led to both its melding with local forms of architecture, of cultural practice, of ritual, but also perhaps its rigidification. What one can see in many diaspora communities around the world. One can see it in language. One sees the preservation of much older languages that no longer bear a lot of resemblance to language as it is spoken in the parts of India from where those communities originated.
Yes, please.
Thank you. I enjoyed the talk very much. I'm just wondering how you feel about the work of, say, the geographers Karen Riggin and Martin Lewis, who for about 25 years now have been decrying scholars for their fixation with continental histories and arguing that oceans and all kinds of large bodies of water connect in ways similar that you have articulated so well in the Bay of Bengal. Not only the Atlantic or the Pacific Oceans, but things like the Mediterranean, the Baltic, the South China Sea, the West Indies, the Caribbean. I wonder if we'd be prepared to kind of call for an all-out assault against our continental-based histories and go along with them and say that the kinds of connections that you are seeing in the Bay of Bengal are pretty typical of maritime connections elsewhere in the world.
Thank you for that. I mean, I admire their work very much, and I think it inspired a lot of historians, to speak from my own discipline, to turn back to bodies of water as the units of NASA. Of course, there's nothing new about that in history. I think of Claudel in the Mediterranean. It's always been a way to write a sort of cross, a history that goes beyond political units. And that was exactly, I think, what Claudel had in mind, to think about the different layers of history that one sees in the Mediterranean. I think it has enormous promise. My only caution is that working on oceans, I think land and borders, it's not long before you push up against them. I mean, I think I can write about the Bay of Bengal and connectivity, and then there'll come a moment in my historical narrative where, in fact, the land does become dominant, that terrestrial borders start to constrain movement, that terrestrial ideas of space and of region divert attention away from these bodies of water. So, one of the questions which Professor Mohan sort of started with, the Bay of Bengal is a neglected region. Most people in the 1970s, 1980s, it would have made no sense whatsoever to think of it as a region. It was simply a body of water. And it's what turns a body of water into a region. I think some of that has to do with the intensity of connections across it, but also, I suppose, it's an imaginative dimension. People think of it as a region. And that's where I think Wigan and Lewis are profoundly stimulating, but they themselves will probably find that one does sometimes come back to the land, because the land asserts its domination over the scene in the second half of the 20th century in a way that probably wasn't true before.
Yes, Sunil.
Thanks. Just following up from the earlier question, I got two questions which I think are interrelated. The first is, when you started off, you talked about names. You said names are very important because we inscribe certain identities. And then at the end, you talked about how building identity narratives about, how do people feel to be part of Bay of Bengal? And I just wonder whether, if you look at how regions get formed and get constructed, especially after 1945, they're all state-led projects, right? Largely state-led projects. And if we follow one from what you say about the Bay of Bengal, state-led projects, of course, are problematic because they come from a certain vantage point with certain states winning or losing out. And so I'm wondering how, you look at terms like the Persian Gulf, they all, either someone from outside imposes it, or the one strong power within the region imposes it. And so how do we do this power knowledge? How do we, traverse this power knowledge question? Number two is, for me, very interesting is this debate, we talk about the Bay of Bengal, we talk about the wider Indian Ocean. Increasingly, there is a sense that you don't have to be physically in the oceanic space to be part of the oceanic space. I'll give you an example. The Americans say they're an East Asian power. They're not in East Asia, but they're an East Asian power. Increasingly, you hear China says it's an Indian Ocean power. Because if you build physical connectivity, you have a state in the region, then you are a power. And so, what does that do to our identity narratives over the Bay of Bengal? Who gets to inscribe what kind of identities we have? Who is a Bay of Bengal person? Thanks.
Those are great questions. I think what's distinctive about the Bay of Bengal as a region over the last 150 years is it is not a state-led region. Prasenjit Dewar, in his very interesting piece, Asia Redux, he wrote about 7 or 8 years ago, differentiates between, in a sense, organic regions that come about simply because of the nature of, or the density of connectivity across them, and what he calls, I think, regionalization, which is a sort of state-led, conscious project to form a more sustainable region. I think the Bay of Bengal has always been one, but not the other. And the question is whether that is changing, and it might well be changing now, as a result of the second of the points that you make, which is that to have a stake in or to exert power in any particular body of water no longer requires territorial control over its littoral. And I mean, there I'm not sure history is much of a guide, because in a sense the only power to ever dominate the Bay of Bengal is the British. And that is an irony, that we're back to that. I mean, I think that's one of the ironic features of this history. And they dominated it because they did territorially control almost all of the states around its rim. And I think now we're in a different moment. What that means for identity, and to return to your first question of how does one foster this sort of identity while acknowledging vantage points and indeed power in how they're constructed. I suppose I would call for plurality and pluralism, that we have not studied this region from all of the different perspectives that we might. To go back to an earlier question, what do fishing communities think of the Bay of Bengal? That's not a question we've asked. I mean, even in my work, I've mostly dealt with long-distance migrants. But in fact, if you think of those who live most intimately and constantly with the Bay of Bengal or in any other body of water, it's very often coastal communities, fishing communities, those who don't move a lot of distance, but who in a sense have a very distinct relationship with the sea. And I think there are those ways perhaps of charting identity and culture, the commonalities of ritual and belief and practice, diet that one might find across different areas that cross borders. I think, ecology offers us something, and I think of the work of Anu Jaleh here in the US on the Sundarbans, which is very much a cross-border history based on cultural practices and beliefs, and I think, there are other such zones. One thinks of, if you think about powers that are not in the Bay of Bengal, but connected to it, we'll think of the Himalayan rivers, and, one can chart all of the riverine nations. Nepal has an interest in BIMSTEC, for example, because of that other kind of water connection that it has with the Bay.
Yes.
Professor, I have two short questions. First question is that very interesting, your history and how it relates to current times. Now, do you think that the Bay of Bengal will be a possible flashpoint? I'm talking in terms of economic and security. I mean, in the past, it was. Professor Chandra Mohan mentioned about World War II. So this is something that is very interesting to us because we are looking at the South China Sea. The second question is, what do your professors in Harvard think about American assistance should there be any problems in the Bay of Bengal? As we all know that there is what you call the Indo-Pacific operations. Now, they don't call it the Pacific, what they call that, fleet. They call it Indo-Pacific. So what do you think? Do you think that the Americans would be involved? There should be skirmishes?
Let me just add to that. I think you talked about when the Indian Ocean was a British lake, Bay of Bengal was a backwater, and that it really didn't mean much. And then when the Indians and Chinese closed it down, but that structure collapsed when the Japanese capitals came and shattered the British primacy in this part of the world, and it was also part of British decline, general sense. But today, I think, to follow up the question he asked, the decline in the United States, because it says retrenchment probably is a deliberate option today, and then the rise in China. So how does that play out in this point?
Thank you for the question. I think there are fewer territorial disputes in the Bay of Bengal than in the South China Sea. To that extent, it is perhaps slightly less likely to be a flashpoint. But clearly the tensions and the opportunity for the heightening of tensions is very clear. That statistic from Carnegie India about a huge proportion of global trade traversing the Bay of Bengal the Andaman Islands being another particular sort of strategically located point, really between South and Southeast Asia, which could come into play. As for American policy, I don't know. I do not wish to sort of venture any guess as to what the current administration will do. I mean, one thinks about the longer term of American policy, then I would imagine that to the extent that American policy remains in keeping with longer historical trends, then they do take an interest in this region. I'm not going to speak either for my colleagues about that I don't know what they think, or for what I think will happen under the current order.
Thanks, Evan. I think if there are no questions, I'll ask maybe two last questions and then we can. You referred to Anagarika, and you referred to Theravada Buddhism. To some senses, you see that again, actually, the Buddhist monks in Burma, the relationship with the Sri Lankan Buddhist assertion, and then Thailand. But that is one part. Maybe you could just expand on that a little bit. That's one. Second is the work of Thomas Metcalfe, that is book, The Imperial Connections, where he actually talks about the horizontal movement. The empire was not running everything, that generated horizontal connections. And the movement of ideas, which someone asked here. For example, how the British slapped the Indian Penal Code everywhere because it was a first attempt at constructing a Western approach to, a modern approach to criminal justice system. Then architecture. I mean, Metcalfe also talks about architecture, whether it is the railway station in Kuala Lumpur, whether it is the other parts of Singapore, where actually the ideas on architecture, for some of it was imperial, but some of it was also probably non-imperial stuff that was traveling across the Bay.
Thank you. The Buddhist links are striking. They are also politically and ethically challenging to us, because I think the way in which historians have evoked that earlier set of Buddhist connections is as a peaceful, cosmopolitan and tolerant set of connections that one has, which are organic and rooted in the culture. What we see now is certainly less tolerant and less open. I think the kinds of links one has seen re-emerging between Myanmar and Sri Lanka, for example, has very often been linked to violence against Muslim communities, both in Burma and in Sri Lanka. So I think, again, one has to think about the complexity of this history rather than falling back, as I think we all have a tendency to do, including many of us who are historians, on a purely happy history of the Indian Ocean. Because I think the seeds of those conflicts are there. One can see the seeds of those conflicts in the history of Burma in the 1920s and 30s. One can see the seeds of those conflicts in the history of Sri Lanka throughout the 20th century. And it is interesting that these connections are coming back, but they often come back in forms that we do not expect, perhaps that we do not want to see. And then finally, the question about Metcalfe's work, I think, is very important. Metcalfe has this argument that even under the British, India is almost a sort of second imperial center for the Indian Ocean. That Indian legal ideas, architectural practices, land laws reshape the whole of the Indian Ocean world, and I think that's profoundly true, and I think that's also behind the anti-Indian sentiment that one sees in many parts of the Indian Ocean world in the middle of the 20th century. Because in a sense, though they were never ultimately in charge, Indian communities, be they Chettiar bankers in Burma or those in East Africa in the 1950s and 60s, come to symbolize external domination. One can almost see them as scapegoats for colonialism. I think that too is perhaps an overly simple analysis, but there is this very powerful sort of symbolic association of India with what was in fact a British imperial project.
So, Professor Sunil, thank you very much for coming here this afternoon and giving us this lecture on Bengal. I think what we've seen now is very stimulating, very enjoyable afternoon. That I think those of us who study contemporary South Asia, looking at political aspects or economic aspects of what's happening in the region, or even technological aspects, it's good to once in a while be lived by history, to to see things somewhat from a longer, detached perspective that opens up how we think about our contemporary condition. And I think that is the value of West history, and one of the, we've seen an exposition of that today, that when many of us instinctively knew that India shut down in the 1950s under the socialist impulse, because everyone was a socialist, including the economy. But then the consequences that some of it preceded that. For example, the nationalist sentiment in India that demanded prevention of export of labor. It was an insult to the Indian nationalism. Those of you familiar with the Indian passport, there is a thing called immigration clearance required. And as always, it affected only the lower classes, those who were not educated, that their freedom to move was actually constrained in the name of national respect, in the name of self-reliance, in the name of standing up to the imperial project. That the consequences of even seemingly sensible ideas, actually the negative and profoundly negative effects that by building India, modern India, and Mehra was a cosmopolitan, yet the strategy adopted on the economic front and his approach, for example, to Indian diasporas, essentially saying, look, he dismantled actually the overseas Indian department, and he said, look, you guys, wherever you are, you should be loyal to that state. I mean, that was not wrong in itself, but it also actively dissociated itself. But today, I think you're seeing a counter trend. I don't know how good or effective in that view, the longer term, the concern for diaspora, the concern for outside. But I think these trend lines are going up and down. I think that's, again, I think we're much better enriched of understanding of our own strategies and policies today with the kind of history that you gave us. I had one last question I forgot to ask you, but if you want to say anything in the last words, that we know that you're working on a new book, Unruly Waters, that's a title. It's about how colonial India, since then, has dealt with the challenges of monsoon and other problems that it has had. So we really look forward to that book. I think whenever you have that book, we'd love to have you back under an ISAS-ARI banner. And for ISAS, of course, it's we're beginning to look at new areas of research, and I think where Bengal is going to be one of them, and to see how transcending some of the recent rigidities in the way India thought about the world, and South Asia has thought about the world. For example, we've already seen some of that. Today, when Sri Lanka stands up and says, we're not a South Asian country, we're an Indian Ocean country. We have Bangladesh, which has grown at 20 years at more than 6%, which is looking upwards. They recently set up a maritime university, so oceanography department. So I think the logic of globalization will have some consequences for each of the units in the region to relate to how we need to redefine our relationship with the sea. And there again, I think some of the new ideas that are coming, like the blue economy, which is really about sustainable development. You spoke a lot about the environmental issues in the Bengal, but today it requires a whole new dimension, which demands actually a cross-country cooperation. But at the same time, rise of nationalism, rise of great power competition produces the opposite effect. So let me stop here and thank you very much, and all of you, I'm sure, have enjoyed this afternoon. Please join me in thanking Professor Sunil.
Thank you, Professor Mohan and Professor Amrith. Professor Mohan will now present a token of appreciation to our distinguished speaker, Professor Amrith. Thank you, gentlemen. We have come to the end of the ISAS-ARI public lecture. We thank you for your participation. We would like to invite you to a tea reception outside this function room. Thank you and have a good evening.